The use of stones as markers of sacred things is very ancient by human beings. The main reason for doing this is that stones are eternal, or they last a very long time. What happens if you set up a wood marker for something? You know, chop down a tree, set it up as a pillar or something. What happens? It'll eventually rot away. It'll tip over, it'll dry out, it'll, get eaten by termites or whatever, and it's gone. Rocks, although they will erode, last much, much longer. So people used rocks and stones as markers of sacred things. The most simple way to do this is to simply get a stone and stand it upright in an unnatural position. Stones naturally fall over to, they don't stand up naturally in a tall position. They fall over, through gravity and whatnot. So if you stand a stone up in an upright position, in an unnatural position, it's a marker. It's a clear indication that somebody's done that as opposed to a natural outcrop. So either by carving stones or by, putting them in strange positions, you mark sacred space. Now in Hebrew, this is called the massebah, which means raised stone, standing stone. It's usually translated as a pillar in the King James Version. Scholars often call these menhirs, which is a Celtic term meaning same thing, standing stone. Now, the simplest way to do this is simply raise one single stone up. And as I said in King James Version, this is called the pillar. And it's mentioned many different times that the Israelites did this. Essentially what happens is, for example, in Jacob's dream, Jacob sleeps, he rests his head on a rock. Hopefully put a cloak or something in between his head and the rock, but at any rate, when he wakes, he has this dream, and when he wakes up, he takes the rock and stands it up as a marker of this theophany that he had. He had a vision of God, right? And that's called a massebah when he raises this stone up. Now, there's several examples of these archaeologically that survive from ancient Israel. This is a place called Arad in southern Israel. It's actually a 7th century Israelite temple. These stones here, these are replicas of the originals which have been taken to a museum. But these are altars for incense burning. And then back here are raised stones. This is a massebah, just a uncarved raised stone. Now the Israelites were permitted to do this, but what did the Ten Commandments say? You don't make a graven image. Don't carve these massebah into images. You just leave them natural. That's what they're referring to here. So these stones are typical of massebah. Now the interesting thing about this is there's two stones in this shrine in an Israelite temple. And what they represent, people debate, but there's two of them there. There's a high place at Petra in Jordan that also has examples of this, only here they took a natural rock outcropping and carved it. So carving a natural rock will also make it unusual and therefore indicate, it's a special stone of some sort. These are just examples here from Petra. This pillar is called Lushar, which means he who owns the mountain. That is the god of the mountain, the god whose mountain this is. It was a marking of the presence of the god by a raised stone like that. Now this is a massebah itself. This is a stone, a natural outcrop stone that was carved, and then into it was carved a picture of a shrine. This is a man-built temple shrine, but it's just a picture of it, in which is a massebah. So it's actually a massebah with a carving of a massebah on it. So you get kind of this nested meta stuff going on. Here's another one of these. This is just a raised stone, but it's a carving of a real stone that was somewhere, but now it's lost. And all that we have left is the carving of it. And this is a very interesting one. This is at the site of Hatzor in northern Israel. And it is Hatzor was destroyed by the Israelites. It's described in the Bible. And the Israelites built a very small shrine there. You can see this is just a little one-room building. This thing is only a few feet tall, maybe 2 or 3 feet tall, so this is a small place. It's got a lower level here with a raised platform of only, 8 inches high, and then on it was a massebah. And that was a marker of the kind of a little shrine they made to commemorate the victory that the Lord gave them over Hatzor. Now this is probably what's called a high place. It's a bima in Hebrew. High place means it means a high place, literally. You go on top of a hill or something like that, and you build a little shrine there. So the high places are described in the Old Testament sometimes. Here is a temple at Shechem, which the Israelites built. This is one of the earliest ones they ever built. Shechem was one of the cities where the patriarchs dwelt. It's up in northern Israel. It's now in the West Bank, but it's now also called Nablus by the Palestinians. At that spot, they raised the massebah and built a shrine for it at Shechem. Joshua that describes the sanctuary of the Lord. This means a temple built to the Lord at Shechem. It's called Mikdash Yahweh in Hebrew. So it's a sanctuary to the Lord. And on this, they wrote the book of the law of God. They took a great stone, set it up under an oak tree. Here's the sacred tree imagery that was in the sanctuary, that was by the sanctuary of the Lord. So they raised a big stone and wrote the covenant on it. So it was a covenant marker. Does that make sense? Now they think they've discovered this stone. This is a modern Nablus. This is a archaeological dig at Old Shechem or Old Nablus, and here you've got a temple, and you can see the size of people there. And then this is a plaza out in front of the temple that was built up into a platform, and then they raised a stone there. Now, when the here's the temple itself. The room with these pillars that would have held the roof, and so you'd have a big structure over this. When the archaeologists found this stone was lying on the ground and it was cracked. You can see it was bigger at one time. It's cracked there. And this is all modern archaeologists setting it up again, kind of restoring it a little bit. But that's the stone, and you can see Palestinians come and draw graffiti on it. So here's another. So this one's another Israelite example of a raised stone. This is a stone pillar of the Egyptians. This is a massive version. I mean, this thing was, it's 100 feet high or something like 70, 80 feet high. It's a huge thing. We call them obelisks, but it's basically just a very monumental version of a raised stone. Now, once you raise one stone, you create a marker that commemorates a covenant, commemorates a theophany, commemorates something like that. This could be a tomb marker as well. So these raised stones are markers. However, you can start to create patterns out of these stones by, lining them up in different ways if you raise multiple stones. And this creates stone circles and stone alignments, which are are variations on this theme. Originally, they seemed to use wooden poles. They raised a pole to kind of mark things, but poles don't last long, so they changed to stones. In scholars call these cromlechs, which is again a Celtic term for stone circle. In Hebrew, the term is Gilgal, which means a circle, literally, and it's a circle of stones. Now, Christ is crucified at a place called Golgotha, right? What that means is a sphere that's in the shape of a skull. The skull's spherical. So it's related to this term Gilgal, which means circle. Golgoth means sphere or dome. Okay? Now, several examples of Israelites making stone circles are known within the Bible. The first one is when the Israelites make a Gilgal as their first sanctuary in Canaan. When they cross the Jordan River, they bring with them 12 stones and they set them up in a circle. This is described in Joshua here. And the assumption is they either had an altar or maybe the tabernacle in the center of this. So this is kind of like making a Stonehenge. And this was the earliest shrine that the Israelites had. Saul was crowned king there, and Saul offers sacrifice there without permission of Samuel and is condemned for this because he was told to wait for Samuel. But all these things occur at Gilgal, which is down in the Jordan Valley somewhere north of Jericho. We don't know the exact site. Here's an example of a stone circle. We already saw this one. This is Rujum al-Hiri. Only instead of standing stones, these are piles of stones, but the effect is the same to create a circular sphere or circular pattern there. Now, the most famous of these stone circles are, of course, in Stonehenge, but we have examples of the same type of thing here in the Near East. And the earliest one we know about, I think, is out here in the Sahara in the Sudan, south of Egypt. It dates to about 5000 BC. Now this area here this is what it looks like today. These are tents of the archaeologists digging out this place. But this was once a lake basin. You can see the depression there. Remember, at this time, this is 5000 BC, right? We're talking about the Sahara Desert being a savanna grassland. inhabited by gazelles and antelopes and zebras and things like that. And the hunters were out chasing them around. And there was a lake basin here in which the animals came to water, and the humans camped there and hunted the animals. And while they were there, they built this stone circle. Now, how do we know all this occurred? Well, you dig up the site, you find seeds, you find pieces of wood that were once a tree. You can date these things. I mean, it's that type of thing. Obviously today, nothing like that could happen, but climate changes through history. We're recognizing that now, and it happens all the time. Now here's the standing stone circle. Actually, most of the stones have fallen over. This one's still left. But they clearly made, you can see the big pieces of stone where they've fallen over, and this is essentially all that's left of it. These aren't too big, maybe this high, not like Stonehenge. But nonetheless, this is the earliest example of this. Now, as I said, the most famous examples of these types of stone circles come from England and maybe northern France. This one is the site of, I've forgotten it now. Anyway, it's one of the stone circle sites. They don't have the stones across the top, but they make it much bigger than Stonehenge. These date to maybe 2000 BC, something like this. Here's one from Scotland. And this one is, of course, Stonehenge, the most famous one. Here they've raised the stones, but they've also added stones across the top, forming what they call trilithons, which are 3 stones. And this then creates more of a doorway-like structure to it, or a roof like becomes a building or something. Another thing they would do is dolmens, which are raising up 2 or 3 stones and putting another stone on top of these. This was done generally as a tomb marker. Now these are dolmens in modern Israel in the Golan Heights. You can't quite see them for the grass, but you can see there's a stone and another stone and then a stone put on top. And they do the burial here and then mark it with these dolmens. That one you can see what it's like. So they bury a guy in there and then cover it up with these stones. And there's literally hundreds of these all over this one area in Jordan where they'd make these. Here's one from Scotland. Or no, this is from Ireland. But they're quite spectacular. And how you got the stones up on top of that with, Bronze Age or Stone Age technology is pretty interesting. How do you think they did that? How would you do it if you had to build that? Could you engineering students do that with no modern engineering equipment, purely by hand power? They think they built a big mound, covered it with dirt, set up the stones and covered them with dirt and dragged the stone up on top and then dug the dirt away. That seems to be what they thought they did, but nobody knows for sure. Another thing is just making a stone mound. This is piling up a lot of little stones to form an unnatural feature, which is a marker of some sort, of human occupation, of human presence, but also of sacred things. This is called gal in Hebrew, which means a heap. And when they say they eat upon a heap, they eat upon a gal in King James Version, this means they pile up the rocks to form kind of an altar or a table. And it's interesting that the difference between an altar and a gal is essentially its use. An altar is a pile of stones that you make to create kind of a platform on which you offer the sacrifice. Okay? You also pile these piles of stones around the stone pillars sometimes. We talked about the stone of witness at Shechem. I showed you a picture of possibly that. Lots of other people do this as well. And essentially the idea here is that whereas you raise one giant stone for the community, when you make a stone mound, or a cairn they're called as well, each person brings one rock and makes the pile. Does that make sense? So whereas a giant stone being raised is done by a community, the mounds is done by the community, but each individual brings a rock, or maybe each family. And so that everybody leaves a mark. Everybody participates in that. And the pilgrims do this all the time. In Tibet, the pilgrims will take a stone and leave it at sacred spots to mark their pilgrimage. And there's a summit in the Himalayan Pass. This is from Tibet. It's at 16,000 feet above sea level. That's higher above Mount Timpanogos than we are to Timpanogos, or about the same height. This is a huge pile of stone. This is the lowest place through the mountain range, right? 16,000 feet above sea level is the low spot. And the pilgrims would go through on this road, and they would leave stones as they'd come to this point. And then these are sticks on which they hung prayer flags, little pieces of cloth with prayers stuck on them. But they get all torn up and ripped by the wind, so they kind of fall over. But everybody who goes by leaves a stone there. So literally thousands, over 1,000 years, 1,500 years, thousands of pilgrims would go by, everybody would leave a stone, marking that sacred passage of the pilgrimage. Now, that phenomenon is using stones as memorials. For tombs, this is often done. You'll pile a bunch of rocks on the grave and make a tomb, okay? When Jacob makes Rachel's tomb, he sets up a massebah there. And Absalom, David sets up a massebah for Absalom. So doing this is often done as tomb marker, okay? It's also a memorial of a covenant. When Jacob and Laban make a covenant, they set up a massebah to commemorate that. This is described in these verses here. Okay? It's also a theophany. That is to say, when God manifests himself, and you make a covenant with God, just as Laban and Jacob, two human beings, made a covenant and marked it with a memorial stone. When God makes a covenant, he is... there's God and a human making a covenant. That covenant is marked by a memorial stone as well. So Jacob at Bethel sets up a stone, he pours oil on it, and then he offers sacrifice there. Okay? So the raising of a stone as a covenant marker or a theophany. What's theophany, by the way? Everybody know what that is? It's a manifestation or appearance of God. It means God manifests himself. So a vision of God is a theophany. Like Joseph Smith's first vision, that's a theophany. Does that make sense to everybody? Okay. When Jacob is at Bethel, he sets up a standing stone, and what does he say in 28:22? He says, "This stone, which I have set up as a massebah or a pillar, shall be God's house." That is, shall be a temple, God's dwelling place. So that's very interesting, that all you got to do to make a temple is set up a stone, and it makes the spot of the theophany sacred. I mean, that's a very, very simple way to create sacred space. And Samuel does the same thing. He sets up Ebenezer, which means the stone of help, as a marker of when God grants victory. Yeah?
I just had a question. Go back to the stone circles. Were those used for the same reason as the Temple of the Leopards, where they just made a circle to outline a sacred place?
Well, it's difficult sometimes to know what was done there because we don't have any written records. But there are places that are clearly sacrifices were done there because they found pits where animal bones and different things are. And there's kind of raised stones that they think might have been used for sacrifices. There are burials near Stonehenge and so forth, although not within the Stonehenge site itself. So it seems to be associated with that type of thing. But they also seem to have been places mainly where the people would gather together for pilgrimage and prayer and religious ceremonies. So they call them ceremonial centers. That seems to be the main function. We talked about when Jacob builds an altar by the pillar that he raised later, he abandons the foreign gods, he purifies himself, changes his clothes, he does all these rituals to indicate that he's abandoning the strange gods. Strange in the King James Version means foreign, not unusual or weird. So he abandons the foreign gods, that is the gods of Laban, who, his relative, and purifies himself. So he's essentially going through a ritual of purification to worship the Lord by this pillar. We talked about the 12 stones that Moses sets up at Sinai, and we talked about the 12 stones of Gilgal. Joshua makes an altar at Mount Ebal, and so forth. I mean, there's a lot of examples. We don't have time to go through them all, but lots of different examples of this type of thing, of raising a stone, creating what's called a mikdash, or a sanctuary, a holy place for the Lord. And notice the one at Shechem described here has a tree, a sanctuary or a mikdash or temple, a pillar, and an altar. It has all those things. So probably most of these sites had this. For example, when Abraham sets up his shrine at the oak of Mamre, he's doing it by a tree. This oak is a sacred tree. And they would frequently do that. Now, the same type of thing was done by non-Israelites, although we have lots of discussion of it in the Bible. There's a massebah at Bet Shemesh, which means the house of the sun, which is what the Hebrews called Heliopolis, the Egyptian temple. And they had a massebah there, which is what the Egyptians called the Ben stone. This is a raised stone or some big natural stone, okay? Rehoboam brings massebah into the temples and stuff. All right? Now, last issue on this topic is what do these sacred stones mean, at least in the Old Testament account? Lots of different symbols are associated with stones. One is the foundation stone. That is to say, when these ancient people would build buildings, they'd frequently lay a bunch of stones on the ground and smooth them all out to create a solid foundation to build something. So the foundation stone is that which makes the building sturdy and permanent. And you see this lots of places in the Middle East where there's a bunch of stones in a square, and on top of them was once mud, brick, and wood, but that's all rotted away, and all you have left are these foundation stones. Okay? They talk about the stone cut without hands. This is a miraculous stone. When humans make the stones, they cut them by hand, but a stone cut without hands means a stone carved by God himself. God is called a rock lots of times. And specifically, the best example is in Deuteronomy, where it says God is a rock, but our God, is not their rock, not their God. So God, symbolized by this rock, this eternal, powerful, unmoving thing. Notice Peter's called the rock too. Now, Petros in Greek means rock, right? But, I mean, what we'd say is his name was Rocky. I mean, this is that type of a thing. It's just, his name's Rock. Christ is called the rock on numerous occasions. There's a rock of salvation. The Lord is the rock of heaven. Okay? The stone is rejected by the builders, becomes the chief cornerstone. This again is the idea of laying these foundation stones. The cornerstone in this case means foundation stones laid on the ground, and the chief one are the ones at the corner, because if they're uneven, the whole building will be distorted. So you got to get the cornerstones really strong and big. So lots of different scriptural examples of that type of